Let's go ahead and call the Johnston City Council meeting number 23-05 to order. Cindy, roll call, please.
Councilmember Cope,
Here.
Evans,
Here.
Martin,
Here.
Reddy,
Here.
Burkhart.
Here.
I want to welcome everyone that is in the audience this evening. It looks a little lopsided here. Everybody's over on this side. It's a good thing we're not on a boat or a plane. I want to welcome all of you this evening. If you are here for an item that is on the agenda, we would ask you to wait for that item to come up if you would like to address the council. If you're here for an item that is not on the agenda and you'd like to address the council, there will be an opportunity under public comments, which will be coming up here shortly. The next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. And Clayton, since you were so nice in deferring your item for another time, why don't you lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the agenda approval. Mike, do we have any changes to the agenda?
None this evening, Mayor.
Okay, council, any changes? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in, Cindy, vote please. I almost went back to the old way of doing
I
things.
like the old one.
Cindy, vote
Councilmember-
please.
Councilmember Evans,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
Reddy,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Cope.
Yes.
Motion passed. Moving on to public communications. We have one scheduled public communication this evening, and that is a presentation from Bravo Greater Des Moines regarding their 23-25 strategic plan.
Thank you so much. We rarely get such a big crowd for a presentation about Bravo. That is really fantastic. I
And
really
they're all
appreciate-
here just to
I
listen
know,
to
I
your
really
presentation.
appreciate you guys making sure the room is full for me. Truly, it's clear that you have a busy agenda and much to do, so I will be fairly brief here this evening. Really, I want to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to present. Support from the City of Johnston is what makes Bravo's work possible, and we're truly grateful for your partnership. I especially want to thank Councilmember Burkhart, who serves as Johnston's representative to the Bravo board. And my purpose here tonight is to give a very high-level overview of what's been happening at Bravo and what we see coming down the pike. I hope you'll ask me questions if you have them. We're very proud of the direction that we're headed. So first, just a quick refresher about Bravo's history. Bravo Greater Des Moines was formed in 2004 when business and community leaders recognized the critical role of quality of life and determined that a regional entity dedicated to arts and culture would not only be effective, but efficient. Originally, we were a collaboration between 9 local partner governments. We now have 17 local government partners, and we continue to act as a steward for hotel motel tax revenues. That constitutes 99.9% of Bravo's annual revenue. Bravo believes that arts and culture are connected to every regional priority, from talent development to economic growth, mental health to transportation. Arts and culture can and should play a role, and that's what we spend our time working on. The strategy that we're best known for is our community investment, our grant-making work. We take our role as stewards of public funds very seriously and are extremely proud to say that as of last year, we have invested more than $50 million since our first grant year in 2006. In our most recent grant cycle, we had 85 cultural partners that were headquartered in 13 of the 17 Bravo communities. This is growth for us. It's interesting to note that that is actually 20 more organizations than we were funding pre-pandemic. I think we all anticipated that things would go the other way. We were surprised to see that there were actually more organizations coming in. The organizations that we fund range in annual operating budgets from anywhere between $2,500 to $24 million. So we do fund a range of organizations providing a range of programming. As it happens, 66% of our cultural partners actually have annual operating budgets below $250,000. They are local, they are niche, they are serving important audiences in their communities. And more than 50% of the organizations Bravo supports are all volunteer. They have no staff. Bravo invests somewhere between $1,000 and $400,000 per organization. So again, you can see there's a wide range, and it's core and central to our mission, this grant making. We know there are other things we can be doing to support the cultural climate, and we're very proud of what we do, but we know that there are other things that our communities need. So we've actually added new grant programs, knowing that not just the cultural organizations, the nonprofits need support from Bravo, but our communities. You all are doing some beautiful work. My goodness, things have changed since the last time I was here. You have beautiful public art outside. You have community engagement opportunities out front. In recognition of that, Bravo has actually added some programs to our grant making to make it more accessible for the cities to get funding from Bravo. So we are actually currently, you should hopefully have gotten an email today that we opened our public art grant programs. The city of Johnston is actually eligible to apply for 2 programs. One is a public art program for anywhere in the community, and the second is a public art program for projects along the Icon Water Trails. We're partnering with the Icon Water Trails. Again, knowing that public art is what makes communities different and special, we want to make sure that you're aware of those 2 programs added in response to the needs from the community. Beyond grant making, Bravo also provides leadership on arts and culture issues and opportunities. We know there are certain things that a single grant to a single organization or city can't accomplish. So we're creating new programs and new opportunities to further align arts, culture, and heritage with regional priorities. One that we're working on right now is Arts and Economic Prosperity 6. This is a national economic impact study done in partnership with Americans for the Arts. 360 communities are collecting the same data. By October of 2023, we're going to have some really, really good numbers to share with you. And we're really looking forward to having that as a comparison to our last study. We also recently partnered with DART to fund bus shelters. We know that communities need bus shelters. If we can also make those an opportunity for artistic expression, Bravo added funding to make sure that we can pay for the art. The shelters are between you and DART, but if you wanted to add art to them, Bravo is covering that cost, knowing again that communities need more public art in more places. And then finally, we run only one program, and that is Passport to Culture, which is to allow students in the school districts in all of the communities that serve, that invest in Bravo, to have access to either in-class or out-of-class arts and culture experiences. And for the 2022-2023 school year, there's more than $11,000 going to Johnston Community School District to support those experiences. So there are lots of ways beyond grant making that we're hopefully providing value to your community and your residents. All of this is important, of course. It has intrinsic value, creativity, innovation, quality of life, but I also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the economic impact that it has. The investments that Bravo is making, and this is from our last AEP study, the investments that Bravo is making in the nonprofit arts and culture sector is generating $185 million worth of economic impact annually across the region. So that year, Bravo invested about $3.5 million worth of public funds, and these organizations turned it into $185 million worth of economic impact. That's pretty good ROI, and we would challenge you to find another sector that's generating revenue like that. Not only is it generating total economic impact, but I also like to call out that it is generating public revenue as well, tax dollars when people come and visit, stay in hotels. It does actually give back to the communities as well. As I said, we'll have more information in the end of 2023. We definitely feel like we are in a post-COVID world in many ways, but I do want to make sure that you understand that all of what I just shared with you is pre-COVID information. There is a lot of impact that we've had as a result of the pandemic. We know there's an estimated $40 million loss to the arts and culture sector in Iowa. And we also know that about 45% of that was absorbed by organizations in Greater Des Moines. As I said, Bravo's 99% funded by hotel motel taxes. We anticipate that's a loss of about $4 million to us over the course of the pandemic. We responded by PPP loans and filed for the ERTC and all the things we were eligible for. We reduced our staff. We invested more than we ever have in the organizations that we support, but that's not sustainable. So we are working on what our coming out of COVID looks like and making sure that we have not only a plan for how to grow and support the sector, but also how to rebuild Bravo's cash reserves and strength so that we are prepared for the inevitable next disruption, whatever that may be. Coming out of the pandemic, just as many of the organizations we support, communities we serve, it's important that you reimagine and take advantage of the opportunity to do what you can to come back stronger. So for Bravo and for the community, we are confident that there is an urgent need to continue strengthening a resilient and connected cultural sector. Again, beyond economic impact and quality of life, arts and culture must be seen as essential to achieving all of the region's priorities. Bravo already plays a leadership role in this work, and we are firmly committed to our evolution into a true regional arts council to continue to champion this. Our new strategic plan focuses on 4 key areas. We will, of course, maintain a primary focus on support for our nonprofit organizations, and grant making will always remain Bravo's core and primary purpose. But for Bravo to remain nimble and responsive and relevant to the future of vitality of arts, culture, and heritage, we also have to intentionally focus on a broader scope of services. We will amplify and champion the role of arts, culture, and heritage in delivering broader economic, civic, and social impact. We will connect and strengthen relationships between the cultural sector and the broader community, and we will cultivate initiatives that establish arts, culture, and heritage as a priority driver of regional identity. Oh, it's working so well. There we go. As we conclude, I do just want to say thank you again for the investment that Johnston makes in Bravo and the work that we do. The role that we play is important, and it is only possible because of the investments of our local government partners. Again, I want to thank Councilmember Burkhart and remind everybody, if there's anything you can invest in to have an impact on everything you care about, I promise you it is arts and culture. I'd be so happy to take any questions.
Anybody have any questions? Todd, I just want to thank you for all that you do, as well as Bravo, to bring arts and culture to our communities. I will comment that we are in line to get one of those art shelters. We're excited, and it's going to be right out here as part of the town center, so that'll be very nice. And also, I think we're having conversation with Icon about some public art down by Beaver Creek and some of the redevelopment that we're doing down there. So we, as you could tell, we've embraced public art, and we're putting new public art in, all the time. So we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. It shows.
Sorry, I do have a question. Thank you very much for what you guys do, and really appreciate that. I have one question on this passport to culture, and you said you invested in Johnston schools. I forget the number.
$11,000.
Okay, so can you explain what is that?
Yeah.
And how they use it?
So Passport to Culture is a program, it's the only program that Bravo runs. Everything else we rely on partners, but we have funds that we give directly to the school district. So every school district in the metro gets a certain amount of funds to support their students, and the dollars that the school district uses are to have kids go either on field trips out to a venue, or they can bring outreach, arts and cultural programming in and have it in the classroom. So that $11,000 is Johnston Public Schools, and it's only elementary students, K through 5 right now, but that's the allocation that goes to Johnston Public Schools so that they have more access to more arts and cultural programming through the school day.
Anything else, Council? Well, thanks again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you.
We are still under public communications. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the council on an item that is not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to public hearings. And we have 4 public hearings this evening. The first one, item 4A, to conduct a public hearing and consider first consideration of ordinance number 1090, an ordinance repealing and replacing chapters 165 through 180, the Johnston zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations. And we'll open this public hearing at 7:14. David?
Good evening. As the council is aware, we've been on a journey over the last about 19 or 20 months of a process to really look at and overhaul our zoning ordinance and our subdivision regulations to do a number of things. This really came out of an effort as we worked through our comprehensive plan the last time. The Thrive 2040 plan was adopted in November of 2020. And one of the key recommendations and implementation strategies out of that plan was the identified need that we really needed to look at our zoning regulations, our subdivision regulations, and make sure that they were working for us as we intended them to do. A number of things really came out of that discussion through the comp plan. We needed to really modernize our code. A number of things had changed since we looked at many sections of our code is from a technology perspective of how construction happens, how development happens. We had a number of implementation strategies within the comp plan that really, we wanted to make sure that our zoning ordinance allowed us to achieve those types of things, from housing styles and those types of things, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We wanted to look at our zoning map. In particular, we have about 50 planned unit developments across the community, and as you review those planned unit development, and those are specific ordinances written for a specific development. As we reviewed most of those really could have just been zoned to a standard zoning district versus a PUD, and maybe had a development agreement in place that handled a couple of small items. But we really have historically overused PUDs, and there's an opportunity there to really look at cleaning up our zoning map and making it easier to understand and easier to implement. We've had a number of inconsistencies between various code chapters. Obviously, we want to support economic development. And most importantly, we wanted to make our code easy to understand and easy to read. And there were, as we've piecemealed our code together over the years, it did not make for a user-friendly or an easy read. And so our hope as we've worked through this process is to make sure that the new code is much easier to understand, much easier to read, and much easier to use for not only staff, general public, development community alike. So as the council knows, Johnston was incorporated in 1969. We adopted our first zoning code in 1970. We did a major overhaul in 1974 where we basically repealed and replaced. We've previously talked about, we did an update in 1982 as well. That was not a repeal and replace. That was just a kind of an overhaul of a small section of our code. So it's been 49 years since any of your predecessors have had the conversation that we're having tonight of actually looking at an update of our entire zoning code. I talked about the zoning map. One of the analysis that we did as we were looking through the zoning code is an analysis of how many different zoning districts we had by classification, and are there duplication? Are there districts that just aren't being used or not being used very often? And why is that? And are there ways that we can clean that up? And so as we went through that process, we had 8 separate residential zoning district classifications. And as we looked at those, a number of those were only used in a small amount of properties. We felt that there was an opportunity to consolidate and clean that up. And so the proposed ordinance does propose to eliminate the R190 district, which was only used on one subdivision, the R150 district, as well as the R1A district. And I'll talk about the R1A district here in a little bit further. And that's a kind of a historic district, only in place on the east side of Merle Hay Road, in an area that was incorporated after it was developed in unincorporated Polk County. In the commercial area, we had 2 districts, the CO and the PC, both of which were only used on a handful of properties. And if you looked at their bulk regulations, if you looked at their uses, were virtually identical as what was allowed. And so a lot of duplication. We also had an industrial commerce park. And as we looked at those 3 districts, and as we looked at opportunities for growth areas as we get into some lighter industrial uses, the classification that really came out of the conversation we had with the Thrive 2040 Comprehensive Plan was looking at employment-based districts. And so the proposal was to create 2 new districts, an E1 and Employment 1 and an E2 and Employment 2, with E1 really being that what's currently the largely the CO and the PC district, really office-oriented, light warehousing type district, and the E2 being more light industrial type of a district, but with some higher architectural standards than what we typically see like in an M1 district, for example. And so that's kind of just a change, kind of in really more terminology and really a consolidation of districts to make it easier to understand and interpret. From a mixed use perspective, we've historically had the mixed use center district, which falls along sections of Merle Hay Road. And under that, there were 3 separate districts, the RO, the ROC1, the ROC2, very complicated to understand ordinance, very limited differences between the 3. And so the recommendation that came out of the comp plan was a simple neighborhood-based mixed use and a community-wide based mixed use district. And so the proposed code has a MU1 or a mixed use 1 district, which would be that neighborhood-based mixed use, and then MU2 community-based mixed use district. The other change that affects sort of all of the Merle Hay Road corridor, probably 25-ish years ago or so, an overlay district was put in place along Merle Hay Road that there was still an underlying zoning district, but the overlay district had certain requirements for street trees, architecture, a few other things. As the years went by, we amended all of our other codes to add in requirements for things like architecture and other things. And basically the Merle Hay Road overlay became obsolete. We were already covering sort of the requirements that were in the overlay in other parts of the code. And so one of the changes we're suggesting as a result of this zoning code would be the ability to eliminate that overlay district. There are 200 and some pages in the new code. We tried to streamline it as best we can, but just do want to highlight some of the high level changes that are coming out of the code. And obviously, as you have any questions as I go through this, feel free to ask those. From a residential perspective, one of the recommendations that came out of the comp plan was really the recognition that if you were developing single family, it was probably a standard zoning district that applied that worked for you. If you were doing a traditional townhome development, there was probably the R3 district that worked. If you were doing anything in between, any kind of association home or a mix between duplex and single family detached, you almost always were required to do a PUD. And so we tried to build in flexibility in as far as the types of uses that are allowed under each of the various stages of our residential districts, and as well as accordingly the setbacks and bulk requirements that go along with that. We have also introduced the concept of what we're calling a side yard, a side corner yard, excuse me, and those are those corner lots when you're on a lot that's on a corner of 2 streets on either side. Essentially, under our current code, that's 2 front yards, and there's increased setbacks and those types of things on both sides. We've tried to build a little bit of flexibility in, and this is something, again, we've seen through a number of PUDs throughout the community. On those cases, you can sort of determine what is the front yard, and the opposite yard that's also along a street would be considered the side corner yard, and there would be some flexibility from setbacks, and as I'll talk about in a slide or two, there's also some flexibility on how you do fencing on those particular lots. We also did a much better job of defining different housing types, from a twin home to a duplex to a 3 or more units in a complex or 4 or more units, and making sure that bulk regulations were set accordingly to the scale of the type of housing. Just alluded to this, but this is a graphic that shows that corner lot scenario and that side corner lot option where really that's functioning as a side yard, but it is along a street. And this, one of the things that the Board of Adjustment has seen many times over the last few years, and we've amended it a couple of times to try to build in some flexibility, but we're still seeing a lot of cases go to the Board of Adjustment for either special exception or variances for fences. This code builds in that flexibility on those corner lots where you'd have a little bit more flexibility to reclaim your yard by fencing it in. So As it relates to accessory structures, we had a sort of a 2-scale system before. If it was smaller than 120 square feet, you could be within 3 feet of your property line. If you were greater than 720, you had to meet your principal structure setbacks, and there was no sort of graduated in between. And obviously, we see a lot of accessory structures in the 400 to 500, 600 square feet. And so the new code does have a graduated scale where that as the structure gets larger, the setback gets a little bit larger as well. So you're respecting the ability to have that accessory structure, but also respecting the setbacks of adjoining property owners. One of the areas that we worked on and talked about a number of different times was accessory dwelling units. This would be a second dwelling unit either attached to a primary structure or a standalone structure on a property. The code does propose to permit those by right with certain standards. In our residential districts, basically our single family through R2 districts. And as I said, they would be with standards, with only one ADU being allowed on a property. The size would be limited to between 300 and 900 square feet. 2 parking spaces would be necessary for the owner, for the main property, and 1 for the accessory dwelling unit. And if it was a detached structure, there would be some setback requirements. I'll talk as I conclude my comments about some of the things that the commission has talked about or changes that we've made since we went through the public comment period. I'll talk a little bit more about ADUs.
David, when you say parking spaces, so that's like in your driveway or?
Driveway, yep.
Okay, so we're not talking about on street.
Off street, yep.
Okay.
Did he just say that he wants
I'm sorry, if you could hold public comment until the presentation is done and the council has asked their questions, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
As it comes to commercial districts and changes that were made into the commercial districts, I talked about sort of the consolidation of a couple districts. The other major change that we've made in the proposed code versus our current code, if you were to open our code today and go to the C1 district, you'll see a list of uses that are allowed in the C1 district. If you want to know what's in C2, you have to flip to that section of the code and read that particular chapter. The proposed code has been done in a table format. So all commercial districts are included in the table. And so you can find a use such as a place of worship. You can look at C1, C2, C3, or any of the districts and see what's allowed there. And SPR in this particular case is site plan review. So that means it has to go to Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. Some uses are permitted with standards, some are just permitted. And so this is a much easier way, much more user-friendly system as you're looking through what uses are allowed in each of those particular districts. We also did a major overhaul of our parking standards. You know, the old sort of theory was you have to park for Black Friday. Well, Black Friday has certainly changed over the last 10 or 15 years. And in general, in a lot of uses, we are over parking our parking lots, which is obviously less open space, more impervious surface for stormwater and all those sorts of things. And so we wanted to try to right size or better quantify our parking requirements. And so generally, you know, there's been a reduction in most uses. We obviously looked at making sure that we weren't under parking, but making sure we were finding the right balance. One of the things that we struggled with in our current code is a number of uses would say, well, you need so much parking for every square foot in the building for patron area, plus the number of employees on a maximum working shift. Well, as a developer coming in, they may be setting up a space for a restaurant, for example, and not know exactly how the inside finish is going to be. So they don't know what the square footage of patron area is. They don't know what the maximum number of employees might be on a work shift. A very hard computation to make. And so one of the things that we did through the course of this rewrite is eliminate those sort of impossible to determine or very difficult to determine and get down to a more basic standard, make it easier to calculate. We also factored in, there are sites like the town center here where you have mixed uses on site that have different times where there's different peak hours. And so there can be a shared factor or shared parking factor applied when you have sort of mixed use scenarios where we don't have to park for two separate uses when they're happening on the same site, that we can, sort of take account into all those parking spaces collectively. And one of the areas where we've commonly had concerns or complaints about parking has been in multifamily dwellings. Our current standard and the our current requirements are based on the number, a set number of parking stalls per unit, regardless of the size of the unit. And the proposed ordinance, we went to a bedroom-based unit, so a sliding scale. If you're on a one-bedroom unit versus a two-bedroom unit versus a three-bedroom unit, we would look at that breakdown and adjust the parking according to the number of bedrooms versus the overall number of units, which we believe will better reflect the actual tenancy of the occupancy of those units. Sort of building off of what was done in the town center, in the overlay district that we have in place here, we're proposing a pretty significant overhaul of our architectural requirements. The still a very, very high standard, as we've come to be accustomed to in Johnston, a very high standard for architectural materials, particularly in our commercial districts. But what we wanted to make sure is we were, one, accounting for new product types, new material types, but also building in flexibility so we weren't sort of dictating a specific design throughout our community. And the way that we have proposed to do that is through a building classification system. So a Class A material, which is a very, very high quality standard material, Class B, which is a very good quality standard, but just slightly below that Class A, and then Class C, which is sort of the trim material and sort of everything else. And then based on district that you're in, there'd be minimum requirements for that Class A material. There'd sort of be maximum in that Class B material, and there'd be maximum in that Class C material. And really what we're trying to do is get a variety of materials used on a building, make sure that a certain percentage of that is very high quality, and so that we're not constructing buildings that are continually requiring a high level of maintenance or repair based on materials that are, don't last as long or require more maintenance. We have built in, obviously we want to be a pedestrian and bike friendly community. We have built in a requirement for bike parking to be accommodated on sites as you get into townhomes and commercial sites. That would be a new requirement. We looked at sort of changing technologies. Obviously, electric vehicles are becoming a much greater trend than they were 4 or 5, 6 years ago. And so what we tried to do was find the right balance of making sure we're not over requiring something, but making sure we're setting ourselves up for future success. And so what we've done in this category is propose to allow them in all districts. And basically, if you get into a situation where you've got a parking lot of greater than 25 spaces or more, you have to consider electric vehicle charging stations. And then essentially what that is making sure that there's breaker space and transformer space accommodated within your plan, as well as conduit running from the building out to your spaces and identifying where those spaces could be. We're not requiring an actual installation of the unit unless you're in a parking lot greater than 100 spaces. And then the number of spaces are shown in that table of how many you'd need to accommodate. We really focused on places where you're most likely to charge your vehicle, places that you stay a long time, apartments, hotels, office and clinics, those types of places. You're not as likely in most cases to pull into Hy-Vee and plug your car in, even if they have a charger, just because you're not typically there long enough to get a full charge. And so we really focused in on those places where you're going to be parking at a much longer time. A lot of discussion around landscaping and open space. And there was a committee that was formed early on in this process where we brought in members of the tree board, city council, as well as the planning and zoning commission. And they really helped sort of steer where this direction went. The proposed ordinance would require 2 trees on every residential lot, new residential lot. So we're not going back and requiring this is only for new development. A slight change in our standard to 1 tree for every 1,000 square feet of required open space. Looking at, again, those parking lots that are greater than 25 lots, requiring additional landscaping, additional trees to help break up those those parking lots, 1 additional tree for every 10 stalls. We looked at our buffer requirements, and in general, we were over planting in shrubs. And we also had certain buffers that required berms, and berms in general are not overly friendly planting places just because there's no existing water table, and so they take a lot more maintenance. And so this doesn't eliminate them from being used, it just doesn't require them as proposed. And then we all know the effect that the emerald ash borer has had on our tree canopy in the community. So we looked at species diversity and require for your first 3 trees, every species needs to be different, or a different genus, excuse me. And then as you get over 20, then there needs to be no more than 20% of any one genus there. We also looked and made clarifications to our tree protection and our preservation chapters to make it more clear sort of what our expectations were up front, making sure we're not just clear cutting sites, that we're doing the study and the research necessary to make sure that we're protecting and saving what needs to be saved and what we can save. We're requiring street trees on arterial and collector roadways. And thanks to the tree board, we've developed a very extensive tree species list that will be able to be used by not only residents, developers, landscapers, to really identify trees and shrubs and where they're most appropriate to be planted. Sort of a great resource that will have available. I will note that we intend to bring that back to you as we look towards actually making the effective date of the ordinance in place, and we'll have you adopt that by resolution at a later council meeting. So I wasn't planning to go through that in depth tonight, but I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any. One of the other areas that we worked on related to landscaping is we often see trees getting planted in landscape islands, and then a couple years later they come out because they're not in a very healthy situation. And so we had added in requirements to make sure that those trees that are planted in those locations have enough soil capacity to accommodate the trees. And so that's what the graphic here displays, is just making sure we're accommodating and creating and planting trees in a location where they'll be successful and healthy. From a subdivision perspective, one of the things that's changed a great deal since the 1970s and the 1980s as we looked at our current code is the Iowa Statewide Urban Design Standards and Specifications is a statewide manual that we all use for subdivision design or public infrastructure design. And so we had a lot of inconsistencies between that standard and our subdivisions. So we've tried to get that consistency back in our code. We've added a requirement that if we have these really long blocks, greater than 990 feet in length, that there's pedestrians accommodated mid-block in those situations, so some mid-block crossings. Again, to make a community that's pedestrian and bike friendly. I alluded to this a little bit on the tree clearing, but a greater emphasis on ensuring sites are suitable for development, looking at slopes and soil types and those types of things. Following a recommendation that came out of the comp plan, a requirement for buffers for land uses that are immediately adjacent to Camp Dodge. You know, they've certainly told us over the years that they have some things and some toys that are kind of noisy, and they want to make sure that anybody moving next to them is sufficiently buffered, and so we've built that into the code. We've added clarification on when private drives versus private streets versus public streets are allowed and permitted, and under what standard. Trying to get consistency there with the fire code, and also, we get from time to time some of those subdivisions with 2, 3, 4, 5 lots, and trying to make sure that the standards are clear what's required in those situations. We've also added clarification on requirements for cul-de-sacs that exceed 250 trips or are longer than 1,000 feet. We've certainly talked about that over the past to make sure that those are maintainable from a fire and a public safety perspective. And then one of the major changes under subdivision is basically we're considering trails as part of our city infrastructure. So today, if we have a map that says we need a trail through this development and a developer comes in and wants to develop it, they can basically get parkland dedication for the installation of that trail. The way we've drafted the new code is that trail is part of our infrastructure. It's not part of our park system. It's part of our city infrastructure, and they'd be required to construct that trail as part of their development, in addition to whatever parkland dedication they'd have to do as part of that. That's certainly, as as we've progressed over the years, we've certainly put a strong emphasis on not only our park system, but our trail system, and we're trying to reflect that in our proposed code. We looked at a number of sustainability items. Stream buffer standards were updated. We had some in place, but there was a model ordinance that came out a couple of years ago. And so we did some updates to make sure that we were consistent with that model. And then we developed solar standards for roof-mounted and ground-mounted systems, and I'll touch on that here in a bit. So that's a very quick and high-level overview of sort of the high-level changes. I want to, before I transition into sort of a summary of the public engagement process we went through and some changes we've made since that went out, what I failed to do when I started my presentation was offer some thanks. So Rita Trapp with Hoisington Kogler Group and Beth have been, Beth Richmond, excuse me, also with Hoisington Kogler have been the two that have really led us through this effort. Rita's online tonight, so if you have really hard questions that I can't answer, she's on backup and will be able to answer those. But they've really done a phenomenal job for us in leading us through this process. As a note here on the public engagement, the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Council have met 3 times jointly over the last 18 months. The Planning and Zoning Commission has had 14 separate meetings. And when I say 14 meetings, I don't mean, oh, they talked about it for 10 or 15 minutes. I'm not sure we ever had a conversation with the commission that lasted less than an hour and a half, because they were so heavily invested in this. And I can tell you the code that's presented to you tonight is much, much better because of all of their effort. We've really taken this to heart and worked really hard on it. You all have met separately 13 times to talk about this at various stages. Can't say all of those conversations were as long as P&Z, but we've certainly touched on all of those topics. And I touched on the subcommittee that was formed early on to really look at landscaping. So it's been a collective effort, a lot of people to get to this stage. So I mentioned we started this in June 2021. When we initially did that, we met with anybody that had really done any development in our community in the last 5 years. And what we wanted to hear was, what are the issues, challenges that were present in our code that were hurdles to you? And so we got that list. Obviously, staff had a list of issues that we had, and we've really been working on it since then of how do we make this better. On December 1st of 2022, we did release the full draft for public review and have been soliciting feedback since that time. We developed an online portal that was viewed more than 1,700 times and received 95 comments online, received 10 formal letters or emails. All of that is attached to your staff report tonight and available for review. I couldn't tell you how many meetings, phone calls, emails that our staff have taken over the last about 3 months. People have really been engaged, and we've had some really good conversations, gotten some really good questions, gotten some really good feedback. That's led to the ordinance that's before you tonight. We had a public open house back in January that was very well attended as well. And while we didn't seek a formal recommendation from the Park Board and Tree Board, we did present the full code to them back in the end of January. The Planning and Zoning Commission did consider this back in February 13th and gave unanimous approval, recommended unanimous approval. They did ask for one clarification related to architectural materials. They were concerned that our Class A definition of glass that prohibits glass with no tint wasn't very clear, as most glass has some sort of tint in it or some sort of reflectivity in it from an energy perspective. And the real intent there is we're trying to encourage glass that's see-through on that first level. And so we did change that language to opaque, as you can see there. So that's the only change, and that's reflected in the ordinance before you. That's the only change that the Planning and Zoning Commission made following their hearing on February 13th. They did have some discussion related to accessory dwelling units. I talked earlier about sort of the requirements that are in place for accessory dwelling units, and the commission's discussion really centered around making sure that the accessory dwelling units weren't overly taxing the lot, that there weren't too many folks, too many cars, those types of things. Ultimately, they did not recommend any specific changes to the code, but following their discussion, staff and Hoisington Kogler did offer to you some possible scenarios there on the right-hand side. You could limit accessory dwelling units by a certain number of not more than 2 bedrooms, for example. One of the questions that came up from the commission is, can we just say no more than 4 residents? Staff is a little concerned about that. That's very hard to monitor, to track, and enforce. Obviously, we can track number of buildings by a building permit. How many folks are living there is harder. Maybe sort of the more palatable one would be to clarify the required parking spaces. And there's some suggested language there that 2 spaces be available for the principal residents and 1 space available for every 2 persons of driving age living in the ADU. Again, that's a little bit harder to define, but would give us a little bit of better teeth, I suppose, if there were complaints that came up. That really is a summary of what came out of the February 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. I will highlight there have been a number of other changes to the code that occurred after it was released on December 1st for public review, based on conversations either with this council at various work sessions or with the Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm going to go through them very quickly at a high level. I would note in the staff report attached was a memo that went in more detail, and so if you have questions, I'll pull that up. But I'll try to cover the highlight here as quickly as I can. Small scale solar energy systems. We did clarify the definition there. We did add a requirement for buffer plantings to make sure that there was some softening of some of those systems from adjacent residential uses. I'll talk about the good neighbor notice, but we did add in that requirement, so any system over 800 would have to notify and make an attempt to notify their adjacent residential neighbors. We clarified that if you're going over a certain size, that would require a special exception, would have to go to the Board of Adjustment. Again, that would require a neighbor notice as well. We did some clarifying language under architectural to make sure we were getting variations in both horizontal and vertical facade. We also made sure it was clear that in commercial districts, we're not desiring to see asphalt shingles be painted, which is from time to time been a concern. We did clarify that beekeeping and small wind energy would be allowed in all districts, not just residential districts. And then I talked about earlier about the E2 district being a new district. We did suggest and do an amendment to increase the allowed fence height in those districts to 10 feet. Our standard district is 6 foot, our M1 district is 10 foot, so we met in the middle with the E2 at an 8-foot district because that E2 district does allow some outdoor storage and in that district. As we went through the public hearing, or excuse me, the public open house, one of the comments we heard was concern from the folks that were in the R1A district. As I mentioned, that's a historical district on the east side of Merle Hay. Our proposal was to rezone those to R175 and add our animal keeping overlay district. The animal keeping overlay was a district we already had in place. However, the restrictions of the number of animals allowed was less than what was allowed in R1A. And so we did some research and contacted the state vet, Iowa State Extension, and basically found that there's no basis for one over the other. And so our recommendation and what's before you tonight is an amendment to the animal keeping overlay that would match the animal keeping restrictions that were already in place in the R1A, which is a slight increase over the existing animal keeping overlay, but matches what was historically there for the R1A. Done some minor amendments related to storage of gasoline in commercial districts to be more consistent with the fire code. We cleaned up the definition of evergreen trees. We added a definition for bird-safe glass and clarified that it is a Class A material. And this is an area, kind of like the electric vehicle charging stations, I think as technology changes, this is an area we'll keep an eye on and monitor, and we may want to come back and make some further restrictions or, further requirements. But we tried to at least introduce the topic as it's currently drafted. And then as previously discussed at a council work session, there was concern about developments coming before the commission and before you without sort of the developer being required to talk to their neighbors. And so we've added in a provision that would require under rezoning, site plans, plats, essentially anything that would come before you for approval, that the developer or the property owner would be required to make an attempt to contact their adjacent owners, and with their application to the city for whatever that proposal is, include a summary of those attempts and any comments received. So we've been informally doing that, particularly on rezonings in the past, but this would formalize that process and allow us to present that information to you as we bring a project forward. And so I apologize for the length of my presentation, but we just covered about 19 months worth of work and a couple hundred pages of code. So I didn't want to, wanted to make sure we gave due process and good time. So with that, I will pause for any questions that the council may have. I know there's some audience folks here. I will note there are 3 public hearings. This hearing is specific to the code itself. The second public hearing is specific to stormwater codes and ordinances that are proposed to be amended. And the third hearing is specific to adoption of a zoning map. So I'd be happy at this point to answer any questions the council may have.
David, before I ask the council if they have any questions, I just want to thank you and your staff for all of your incredible work on this. As you just said, it took 19 months to get through this process, and it's obviously been a labor of love for you as well as everyone who helped you. So a lot of work here, a lot of good work here. Huge investment, and our community will be better off for it. So just want to acknowledge your work on it as well. Council, have any questions for David?
Mayor, I do.
Okay.
I want to also enforce what the mayor has already said. It's a tremendous amount of work, and I appreciate that you are always very polite to all the tree board and the park board, and very patient with those of us who don't exactly understand how to get to where we wanted to get, which was, a lot of it was saving more trees and protecting our natural environment. And you never told us we couldn't do it. You figured out a way to help us. So I appreciate that. And so I just want to pick on you just a little bit. And maybe Rita will have an answer for this. What does the code say about artificial turf? Now, I'm not talking about artificial turf when someone has a dog run, but artificial turf when it's used in parking lot islands. It seems to be a sterile solution, and some artificial turf will let water go through it, but some doesn't. So what does our code say?
I'm going to, hopefully Rita can help me on that one.
Yes, I can search the code faster than you can at the podium. I assume you can hear me then, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you wanted to know where it is, it's 181.01. And so it says that you can use it as a ground cover, but it has to be professionally installed. It has to be documented as permeable and maintained as permeable over its lifespan. That's what we had landed on as the language relative to turf.
Okay. Thank you for that. The next thing I would like to ask about, I saw the edits on the opaque glass. And this is interesting because I've been to Back Pocket a few times, and I've also walked past there on Merle Hay Road, and there are 2 windows that lead into visual into their storage room and into their kitchen, and you can see a stainless steel sink. And it's not a very attractive look for Merle Hay Road. So if we're saying that they cannot have an opaque glass, does this mean we're going to have more of this potential?
Let me clarify that. So you can have opaque glass. It just falls under a Class B material versus a Class A material.
Okay.
And in which that particular building, they could put a screening on those to make it opaque, and they'd still meet the requirements.
Okay.
What this really gets to is, and the Panera Bread building is a great example of that. They're a pretty opaque finish on those windows. And if you drive through the parking lot, drive along Merle Hay Road, you struggle to see if lights are on inside the buildings. And so we're trying to make a pedestrian, particularly in a commercial setting, where you're comfortable walking up to a setting, you can sort of see what's happening in a building, and making sure that that kind of glass is a Class A material versus if it's just covered and you can't see in, you can't see what's going on, then that would be considered a Class B. So it wouldn't prohibit it, it just changes the classification of it.
And what do I do about not wanting to see the industrial sink?
We can talk to them about
That
that.
would be awesome.
I'll add it to my list.
Lots of ways to solve that.
Yeah.
Um,
We don't have to do that by code. We can do that by
Just
phone
have a
call.
conversation.
Yes.
Tell them we'll get them another shrub.
Yep.
Topsoil depth. Now, I know that the state has gotten involved in this, and I don't know where we stand.
That's the next section of codes.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
So I've jumped ahead.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's basically all my questions, and I do appreciate what you did in terms of bringing up the bird-safe glass. I understand that we need more study of it, but at least you've introduced it, like you said, and that's very appreciative. Thank you.
Council, have any other questions for David?
Mayor, I do have one. David, somewhat in generalities, but the question was triggered specifically when you were discussing EV charging stations. For existing locations, commercial entities, government and municipalities, schools, et cetera, at what point would this new ordinance come into effect to them?
This would only affect them if they were doing a substantial change on their site that required a site plan. So if they're existing as they're going about their daily business, this requirement wouldn't come into place, other than if they came in and said, we want to add them. There, there's some provisions of where we'd allow them and those sorts of things, but they wouldn't fall under that, oh, you have more than 100 stalls, you need to add one, or you need to plan for the capacity, unless they were doing a major site improvement or a major building improvement.
All right, thank you.
Yep. And that, I should clarify, that goes for almost all of the changes that I talked about. It's really, they're development driven. They're not retroactive. We changed some things, but we're not going to go out and start enforcing that new ordinance. Anything that's been approved under our current code is approved under our current code. So,
Thank you.
yep.
Council, any other questions for David? This is a public hearing on this item. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the council? You want to step forward and give us your name and address?
Hi, I'm Troy Peterson. I live at 6045 Northwest 61st Avenue. And I'm assuming that the card I got has to do with the zoning changes. I'm just trying to clarify what the postcard about zoning changes to our property or property.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
if you hold off on that, and maybe David can preempt your question when he comes up and gives the presentation. There's 3 public hearings tonight, yes. State your name and address, please.
Matthew Lepke, 6722 Peckham Street, here in Johnston. By way of introduction, my master's degree is in urban planning. I've been a public sector urban planner for over a decade in different cities, different states, from 11,000 people all the way up to 500,000 people. I've administered some good codes and some pretty poor ones. I've written and amended code sections and long-range plans. Now, first off, as I said at the Planning Commission meeting, I really respect staff's effort on this. I've sat through a lot of meetings like this, and I know how much time and effort and frankly, emotion and passion go into it when you devote literally over a year and a half of time on something like this.
You sound like a good candidate for an appointment to a board or commission.
Hold up on that, we'll see. But having said that, while I was working for the city of Colorado Springs, my fellow senior planner wrote that city's ADU ordinance. I was thankful I wasn't the one who had to do it. That's a difficult thing to do. Now, that city has a housing crunch, and I've not seen evidence of something similar here in Johnston. Put simply, I don't believe under any current circumstances that ADUs or two-family dwellings should be considered in any of the R1 zoning districts. Not all of the R1s are currently considered, I understand, but multiple are. My particular concern is when the special use process is being removed, as proposed in the current code. That's a vitally important safeguard for all residents. I think we need to understand that property owners in these R1 districts have made significant personal investments in their properties with the general understanding that neighbors' properties will only contain one dwelling unit. The ability to construct another household, which is what an ADU amounts to, as we discussed at PZC again, on a single family lot that doesn't preserve the reasonable expectation of residence for single-family lots to be in single-family zone districts and therefore only have a single-family dwelling unit. In the proposed code amendment, duplexes and ADUs are permitted with site plan approval in multiple R1 zone districts. As you heard earlier, as David mentioned, that essentially makes them a by right use, which is a mistake that I think must be corrected. We need to ask, what are the specific standards that will govern these? Are they the criteria found in 190.035C3? My reading of those is that they are not specific enough as to provide adequate safeguards to adjacent property owners. I would say, frankly, they appear a little vague and subjective. As you heard David mention a moment ago, regulating the number of residents and cars is very difficult. So why put city staff in a bad spot? Because of how difficult it will be to govern these things. So at minimum, I would say the special use process must be maintained. It doesn't make sense that a property with a 4 or 5 bedroom house may then put another 900 square foot apartment in the backyard for 4 more unrelated people to rent it. I know we don't concern ourselves with who's related to whom in these, but I can see a situation, having been a college student, having been a grad student, where you want to save money, you get together with some friends, you rent a place. The proposed regulations would allow 4 unrelated people on many R1 lots. That's a separate dwelling unit. The lots were not platted for that purpose. I think it's important to keep that in mind. And additionally, with ADUs or duplexes in single family neighborhoods, the infrastructure demands would greatly increase. Were our R1 neighborhoods engineered to handle such a use? Another important question. Parking requirements were touched on briefly. Something I don't understand in the current draft is, why would a 1 or 2 family dwelling unit only require 2 off-street parking spaces, but then an ADU that could have 4 people only needs 1? It doesn't make sense. After all, it's winter right now. We're clinging to the last vestiges of it. Where will those other 3 people park if they have 4 people in an ADU when the plows are out to plow the streets? They won't have a place. One of the things I mentioned at the Planning Commission meeting is that people can turn ADUs into rentals. I know traditionally in Johnston, thankfully, people have generally used them, mother-in-law suite, granny flat, whatever name you want to call it, family member. However, there's no prohibition on renting ADUs in the code. In multiple cities where I've lived, people didn't care at all about having family in them. They simply rented them like apartments. And I don't think we want to make that mistake here. In summary, the city is considering a fundamental change to the very concept of single-family residential zoning. And I think it's one that's incompatible with the built environment in most R1 zone neighborhoods. Removing the special use permit review process is regression. That's not progress. So now is the time, while we have this before us, considering a code amendment, to remove the possibility of having more 2-family dwellings or ADUs in any R1 zoning district. It makes things simpler for the city. It makes things simpler for the residents. It's simpler all around not to introduce a second dwelling unit on R1 lots. So I appreciate your time. I think there are several good changes in this code. However, again, I ask, please don't allow any duplexes or ADUs in R1 zone districts. I think they create a lot more problems than we make sense now. It only takes 1 or 2 people to change how those are used in the city to create something that, once code allows it, it's very hard to contain. Thank you for your time.
David, do you have any comments to share on that? Or I know you've apparently heard this issue because it was raised at the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Yeah, I mean, I'd refer back to, I mean, as drafted, the code would allow accessory dwelling units by right with certain standards and certain requirements. There's that, then that was discussed at the Planning and Zoning Commission, that was discussed at work sessions months ago as we were looking at this. Certainly one route is to require them or allow them, but only require them or only allow them if there's a special use permit or a special exception or something else granted. That wasn't the direction that we received early on in the process, and so it's not currently drafted that way. The commission's discussion at their hearing was really, is there more restriction that should be put in place? And I touched on that earlier ago, that there are some things we could look at. They ultimately didn't make any recommended changes to the code that hearing, you certainly can.
That's helpful, David.
David, before you, so could you outline if you went kind of a special exception route, or in essence, so it's not by right, you have to, in essence, apply, how does that process work?
Special exception or special use permit both have a similar process. They'd go to the Board of Adjustment, and there would be a neighbor notice requirement that would go out for all property owners within 320 feet. And then the Board of Adjustment would make a decision.
Does the Board of Adjustment have any limitations on its ability to grant?
They would typically have a list of requirements like we have in the code today, where these are the things that they should consider.
But it's not like a variance.
It's not a variance.
right?
There's no hardship requirement or anything like that, correct? But typically there's things that they should consider or conditions they may impose, kind of a thing, which would really mirror what we have in the code, largely mirror what we have in the code. Those are things they look at, is their parking, is their
Infrastructure, adequate
Right.
infrastructure, some of
Yep.
those things.
Well, I'll just remind everyone that this is first consideration of this ordinance. There is certainly opportunity to make some changes. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name, but I would encourage you to share your comments with the council members in writing via email. It would be helpful to just see specifically the issues that you raised here this evening. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to address the council on this particular item?
Mayor, my name is David Rupiper. I live up here at 5680 Northwest 64th Place. I guess my first question would be, what initiated getting these additional units? The main concern that the gentleman had earlier, if we didn't have it in our code previously, what initiated that to be brought in to allow these separate units on a residential district?
Yeah, but-
Couple other comments and questions, and I guess if you can come back to that. This would be more related to if any changes in the map and the zoning and the regulations and the bulk regulations, if it creates any non-conformings in a residential zone especially, and what you're going to do and consider and if it causes a non-conforming at any point, not only with the zoning change, but with any future right-of-way acquisitions that would occur along a property that would cause a non-conforming. So don't really need the answer right now, but those are a couple of concerns. But again, the main question I have again was, what initiated putting this into the code that really is causing more regulators out there to check things and watch things? And we've got enough on everybody's hands now as it is to keep track of things that are in the ordinance at this time. So appreciate your time.
Thank you. David, can you help answer those two questions? Why the issue of ADUs came up and was considered for inclusion in the code, as well as what do we do with non-conforming?
Yeah, one of the things that I did not cover probably very well, and I gave my presentation that I'll pull up from the actual draft code that's brand new in this code that is not in our current code. Is this whole chapter related to accessory use specific standards? And so our current code, there are accessory dwelling units are permitted. They are permitted by special use permit. There are no guidelines in our code at all as to what you might review or what conditions that the Board of Adjustment might apply, other than our general, if they're looking at a special use permit, here's the general requirements. There's nothing specific to an ADU. And so one of the new things that we built into the code there are a lot of uses that from an administrative perspective can be reviewed, and we can make sure that they meet these requirements, whatever they might be. And so this whole accessory use specific standards, chapter 177, is completely new from our current code. None of this exists at all in our current code. And it's things like ADUs, and here are the conditions under which they can be allowed. Accessory retail, accessory structures already exist as a standalone, but they've been built in here. Car washes, the type of car wash and what districts, generators, specific requirements on decks, drive-through facilities, home occupations. These are all the other things that are an extra layer of conditions or considerations that can be reviewed either by the council as they're reviewing a site plan, by staff as they're reviewing administrative things. So that's all been built in. As far as sort of what precipitated or what initiated it, it's just a change in how we're approaching, this whole idea of approaching these standards. Certain uses with adding standards is not something we currently have in our code. And so absence of standard, then it's went to the Board of Adjustment. And so the idea is if there are things that we can develop a standard for that don't require that extra step, then let's try to build that into the code. And that's what we've tried to do. As far as nonconformities, I can't stand up here and say we haven't created a nonconformity. That's certainly possible. We've tried and everything we've done to not create a nonconformity. There's certainly standards have changed, but anything that's existing today, approved today under our current standards would be, if for some reason became a nonconformity, would be grandfathered in and would be considered a legal grandfathered status. So we've tried, and this is a couple hearings that we talk about the zoning map. We've really tried to limit the amount of rezoning necessary to just those districts that we've eliminated to try to avoid, again, creating any of those nonconformities that unintended consequences might be out there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is there anyone else that would like to address the council on this item? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing then at 8:11. We do have the ordinance for first consideration before us. Do we have a motion to approve first consideration of ordinance number 1090?
Just want to clarify, there'll be an opportunity after a motion. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion?
Mayor, I do think it's been a good discussion tonight, especially around the issue of alternative dwelling units. And I do think some good points have been made about whether R1 is appropriate for the entire, for ADUs. I think there's I'm certainly comfortable supporting this zoning ordinance as it is tonight for first reading, but I would like staff to prepare an amendment for our consideration at the next meeting that would for ADUs in a R1 to require a special exception process. I'm not comfortable with it to be done by right. I think we need to have some review process. We've kind of gone through this as part of the discussion on ground-based solar or even some of the other items where we've tried to build in sort of an opportunity for people to weigh in. And I just think I think that's should be the approach that we take on ADUs and not just sort of open it up with no sort of review process. So would like to have staff be prepare that amendment for our consideration, which would occur at our next council meeting, which would be 2 weeks from tonight, I believe. So.
Mayor, I would like to say that I agree wholeheartedly with Councilman Cope. I also wonder if an exhibit could be done. Take a typical lot, take my lot, and tell me if I'd be allowed to put an accessory dwelling on it, how far back. I mean, you have to have so many square feet of lot. You have to, there is, I'm assuming, you couldn't build a structure too large on certain lots. You can't take up all the green space. And I did like the comment about, is our infrastructure for these neighborhoods going to be able to support a secondary dwelling, additional people, the parking. So I wholeheartedly agree with what Councilman Hope has stated about getting a little bit more information about this and this amendment where it still comes before us for, or there's still a review process. I totally understand why we're trying to get this into the code, because not having guidelines is really tough for the Board of Adjustment and anybody else who's trying to figure out what is the right thing. Having guidelines are great, but in this case, there was a lot of things brought up that I hadn't thought about, so I would like some time to think about that.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Is the concern just the detached accessory dwelling? Because they can also be attached to and quite frankly, most of ours in our community are attached to the.
Almost
from
seems
the
like an attach is a building extension. I am thinking about the detached accessory dwelling.
I guess, but some of the challenges about parking and infrastructure would
And
be,
space and how
would
much,
be
yeah.
applicable whether attached or detached. So, you know,
Not sure the difference.
I will tell you that this is an issue that I've not given a lot of thought to, and I and plead. This is my second time we've brought up criminal law tonight, but I'm not. So I think we just have to tread carefully, and even in thinking about, when we say not wanting it in R1, maybe there's other our residential districts too, that where we should, I just think sort of a general exception process of having it go to the Board of Adjustment, have the Board of Adjustment look at it and determine if it meets the requirements is a good public process, gives out neighbors an opportunity to weigh in. I think any time that there's more discussion and more opportunity to give your voice, that usually results in a better outcome. So I think that's kind of what I think we should encourage.
David, what I would suggest that you do is you prepare a memo for us to consider that would identify the issues that we need to be taking into consideration. And I would, again, encourage the individual who brought the issue to us tonight, if he has any additional information around this matter, giving us a little more direction on what your thinking is, that would be helpful as well.
The representative from HGKI would like to weigh in as well.
I'm sorry.
The representative from HGKI wants to weigh in as well.
Okay.
Go ahead, Rita.
Oh, thank you. I just respectfully, certainly I understand the need for more discussion. I do want to point out that, when we're talking about adding something onto a house, we don't have size limits of a house. So I could have a single family home and have 11 children and have a huge place. So that's one thing that as we talk with other communities about that, it's kind of that weighing that conversation about it. So again, I understand why more conversation is needed because people don't anticipate having an ADU. But as we have that conversation the next time, it's probably important to recognize that we don't put limits on single family homes other than what you can fit on the lot structurally. We have a height, we have that, but we don't say you can't have so many square feet and that impacts the infrastructure. So that's one thing we've found when we've had conversations is kind of trying to be consistent as we look at those types of things. But I understand why there's a concern about it. So I'm not saying you shouldn't, but kind of also keep that in mind that we don't do that side of it where just if it's a single family home, we don't say you can't have so big. So that's a conversation that we've had.
Yeah, it's issues like that that we would hope that David would put into a memo form for us in writing and provide to us so that we can consider those. So appreciate that. Council, have any other discussion on this item? If not, we have a motion and a second. Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Martin,
Yes.
Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Cope,
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
Motion passed. Moving on to item 4B, conduct public hearing and consider first consideration of ordinance number 1091, an ordinance repealing and replacing Chapter 102 Storm Drainage System, Chapter 103 Stormwater Management Utility, Chapter 145 Post-Construction Stormwater Management, and Chapter 151, Tree Protection and Conservation. And we'll open this public hearing at 8:19. David.
Good evening again. This is a collection of changes that are a direct spin-off of the work that you just talked about as far as the zoning code. As we looked at all of our codes, stormwater management obviously is a big part of development, zoning, and subdivision development. And so we wanted to make sure that those standards were also up to current standards. Part of this change is really just getting things put together in the city code in the same place. And so the first part of this, Chapter 102, storm drainage systems, we're not really proposing any changes there. We're just moving that to Chapter 85. And then Chapter 86 would be stormwater management utility. Again, not really any changes there. We're moving that to Chapter 86. So there, we were out of room in the 100 section there where the stormwater was. And so we want all stormwater to be together. And so 85 and 86 are really just moving what's currently 102 and 103. Chapter 87 would be a new chapter specific to stormwater management. This is currently lumped under Chapter 145, which is our collection of everything related to stormwater that just kind of got lumped in. It's a very hard chapter to understand and to read. And so we've tried to separate that out. So everything related to stormwater management, this would be the requirements that the developer has when they're developing their site, of the standards they have to meet, would fall under Chapter 87. Chapter 88 then would be everything related to erosion control. And again, most of that currently lives in Chapter 145. We've separated them out because while they're related, they're separate, and we want to make sure they're clear and easy to find restrictions. The other changes here, Chapter 151, Tree Protection and Conservation, got moved into the zoning code, which you just took action on. And so that's why that chapter is being removed as a standalone, really bringing that in under zoning. Still maintaining those requirements as we talked about earlier, making some changes there. The real change in all of these chapters relates to Chapter 87, as we've made some tweaks. We've long had a pretty high standard for stormwater management in our community, dating back to about 2008. About 2 years ago, there was a concerted effort through Capital Crossroads to look at and come up with a model ordinance. In a couple areas, we were more restrictive than that model ordinance. And so we have, in this proposal, made some tweaks to that, and it relates to kind of flood control. Still requiring flood control, it's just the way it's calculated. We've made some tweaks there that would match the model code. To Councilmember Martin's earlier question about topsoil, we don't currently have, and in the current draft following the model, we don't have a minimum topsoil requirement in this standard. We do under SUDAS, so anything done in the right-of-way has an 8-inch topsoil requirement, but we don't have anything specific to a minimum number of inches that has to be restored. Obviously, you have to save your topsoil on site and it has to be respread and all those sorts of things, but we don't have a specific number of inches currently.
Does the state have a requirement of spreading topsoil on a housing development
Yeah,
wouldn't
there's
have?
best management practices in this. And so part of the reason this is a public hearing versus just a normal ordinance. We are adopting by reference the Iowa Stormwater Management Manual. So since that's a statewide code, state code requires us to adopt this by public hearing or conduct a public hearing before adopting it. And so there are best management practices in there. And so one of the practices that you can use to meet your stormwater management requirements is topsoil remediation or soil quality restoration. And so that's a practice. It's just not a required practice. And so we haven't went to the level of requiring a certain level, but that's one way that they can meet their stormwater requirements.
Okay.
So that's a very high level summary or overview. Be happy to answer any questions here. Again, most of the changes, we're just moving things around to better flow within our code, but stormwater management is where we really had them.
David, follow up on Councilmember Martin's questions on the requirement on replacing topsoil or minimum level of it. Do other communities in the metro area require a specific amount?
Only Clive, I believe. In the metro. Most don't have a specific requirement.
Most don't, but some do.
Some do, yep.
And what, was there not just recently, there's a bill going
There-
through in terms of required topsoil?
There's one hanging out there, yeah.
Yeah,
Topsoil and other
I
stormwater.
thought the state required a certain
it
amount.
used to, but I think it got repealed somewhat.
It used to require 4 inches of topsoil, and then it got
Part of the
Took it
general
out.
permit number 2.
The home builders didn't want to,
So what is the requirement now?
There's not a specific requirement. So the manual, Iowa Stormwater Management Manual has, basically it's a series of best practices. And as you develop your site, you have to meet certain standards, and it's a toolbox. So you can go right down through the toolbox and decide to pick this item and this item and this item, and soil quality restoration, that restoration of that topsoil is one way. And then there's a quantification that you can get, and you can, show, then you can reduce the amount of volume you need in a basin and those types of things. So it's not uncommon for developers to do it. It's just not a specific requirement that we've had.
I'd be interested in seeing what Clive and Ames are requiring.
Provide that.
We can save a lot of water if topsoil is replaced.
I would-
Reduce the amount of irrigation that we see happening.
and I was going to say, Mayor, it's probably one or two top items that I get email or calls on from homeowners, is the lack of topsoil.
I was surprised when we built our house that the builder told me that he was hauling that black soil away. I just was amazed. And that was before there was any requirements in state law. Other questions or comments for David, Council? This is a public hearing on this item. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to make any comments? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing then at 8:26. Do we have a motion to approve first consideration of ordinance number 1091?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Cope,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Martin.
Yes,
Motion passed. Item 4C, conduct a public hearing and consider first consideration of ordinance number 1092, adopting an official zoning map. And we'll open this public hearing at 8:27. Clayton.
Give David a little break here for a moment. This is the third hearing related to adoption of the new zoning code. As David had alluded to earlier, there are several zoning districts that are going to be eliminated in their entirety, either through consolidation or just outright elimination in the new zoning code. And so as a result, there are a handful of properties throughout the community that would need to be rezoned to a new zoning district so that we have a means to effectively administer the new zoning code. So as part of your agenda item, there was a map book provided that highlighted the individual areas of properties that will need to be rezoned, as well as the overall zoning map that would be adopted. I do want to emphasize that all the zonings being proposed are just as a matter to make sure we can administer the new zoning code. There is no active development plans associated with any of these. If they were to want to propose a development, there would have to be separate action items associated with that with separate public notices as well. We did provide public notice to all property owners within 350 feet of the properties identified to be rezoned. So I think I sent out about 650 postcards, and I believe a handful of property owners here have received those. I did just want to take a moment and scroll through the map book just so we're all on the same page of the properties that would need to be rezoned. We got properties just north of Wooded Point Drive and Peckham Street. This is 86th Street and Northwest 70th Avenue. This is an area of R190. It's the only area in our community that has this zoning designation. This is one of those districts that's proposed to be eliminated in their entirety, and then the district would be rezoned to R175, consistent with the adjoining properties on the south side of the road. There are no known nonconformities that would be created as a result of this. Second property here, just west or just east of Northwest 100th Street at the intersection of Northwest 68th Avenue. So the high school is just down here in this AR area. We got a property zoned R1 150. We have a handful of the R1 150 scattered throughout the community, very sparsely used. So that's a district that's proposed to be eliminated. This would get rezoned to R175. This property does currently have the animal keeping overlay district, and that would be retained with this new zoning as well. There's no known nonconformities that would be created as a result of this. David advised that the whole Merle Hay Road overlay district would be eliminated. So there's nothing that this would be replaced with. This is just a straight repeal that overlay zoning district, and that encompasses pretty much the whole stretch of Merle Hay Road from the interstate north to Northwest 66th Avenue. And I believe all of the requirements that were within that overlay district have been accommodated within the base zoning districts as well. So there's really a net zero change there. Just north or just west of Northwest 100th Street at Northwest 82nd Avenue, again, property R1 150, as well as along the east side of Northwest 100th Street at Northwest 80th Lane. Those are R1 150, again, being eliminated, proposed to be zoned to R1 100, with the exception of this triangular piece here, which would be zoned to R175, consistent with the Hidden Valley Estates development. That is a public parkland parcel. There are no known nonconformities that would be created as a result of this change. Again, another handful of R1 150s that have been used and proposed to be eliminated. These would be rezoned to R1 100. There are a handful of properties kind of on this western stretch here that do currently have the animal keeping overlay district. That's proposed to be retained with this. There are no known nonconformities created with this area as well. Second area, R1 150 along Northwest 100th Street, Northwest 62nd Avenue. The farm area would be rezoned to AR, Agricultural Reserve. Future development of that parcel would necessitate rezoning of that. And then there is an existing home there that would be rezoned to R1 100. Again, no known nonconformities that would be created. Just on the northeast corner of Northwest 100th Street and Northwest 54th Avenue here, there are 3 properties scattered within this development that are currently zoned IC, Industrial Commerce Park. That's a zoning district that's proposed to be eliminated and really consolidated as kind of a merger between those CO, PC, and IC districts. And the proposal here is to rezone those to the E1 office employment. That's the lower of the two. And the uses of that generally are consistent with the existing IC district. And there are no known nonconformities that would be created in this area. John Deere Financial, currently zoned PC, professional commerce, that'd get rezoned to E1. Again, no known nonconformities that'd be created. Primarily along Pioneer Parkway, Northwest 62nd Avenue, the Corteva headquarters and greenhouses, as well as a select handful of other properties kind of down along Corporate Drive and Pioneer Parkway. Those would get rezoned to the E1 district from the PC. No known nonconformities that would be created here. Within the Merle Hay Road mixed use center, so Northwest 62nd Avenue, Merle Hay Road, we're sitting in it right here, right now. This is the area that we currently have those, the mixed use center with those 3 underlying sub-districts within it, and very similar aspects between them. So all of this would get rezoned to MU2, community mixed use. There are some areas down on the southern end, the Fairway, Shine Shop Car Wash, the Dollar Store, the daycare. Those would get rezoned to our C2 community commercial district. And then there is a kind of a standalone parcel next to Bishop Drum that would get rezoned to R4 to be consistent with that adjoining use there. There are no known nonconformities that would be created in this area. Down at the intersection Pioneer Parkway and Merle Hay Road, we have 2 parcels currently zoned CO. I believe these are actually the only 2 CO properties in the entire community. This far western one is the northern part of Child Serve. That would get rezoned to our C1 neighborhood commercial. And then the eastern one, which is the former Men's Garden Club of America, that would get rezoned to C2 community commercial. No known nonconformities created here. The area east of Merle Hay Road, generally along Northwest 55th Avenue and Northwest 57th Avenue, currently zoned R1A, modified single-family residential. This is a district that has historically allowed animal keeping. These properties are proposed to be rezoned to our R175 district with the animal keeping overlay added to them so that they would retain the ability to have the animal keeping as they previously and currently are allowed to do. And there's no known nonconformities that would be created as a result of this. The one exception here, not to nonconformities, but the kind of that eastern section of the parking lot for the church at the southeast corner of Merle Hay Road and Northwest 57th Avenue would get rezoned to C2, and that would be to bring the church's entire parcel into consistency with under the same C2 zoning. And there are a handful of properties along Johnston Drive that are currently zoned mixed use center. Those would get rezoned to our neighborhood mixed use, as well as the area for the future dog park would get rezoned to CD Conservation District. Up along Highway 141 and Northwest Saylorville Drive, we do have a parcel that's currently zoned IC, Industrial Commerce. Again, that district is proposed to be eliminated, and it would get rezoned to our E2 zoning district. This is currently an agricultural farm field. However, there is a developer looking at submitting development plans here, which precipitated the rezoning to IC last year. So this would just further their ability to develop according to how they've generally indicated to council. And the final one I have here is corner of Northwest 70th Avenue, Northwest 86th Street, that northwest quadrant. There's a section of the farm field that's zoned PC, Professional Commerce Park. That would get transitioned to E1, which is the most like districts to that, and allow for development consistent with that, if so desired in the future. With that, happy to answer any questions, go into further detail as needed.
Council have any questions for Clayton?
So Clayton, just on that last item where the last map, where it goes PC to E1, why not a residential type classification?
Because, so our comprehensive plan would recommend it going to a residential designation. The current property owner does not have immediate desire to rezone it to residential. And therefore, just we're trying to keep it like for like.
Okay. I mean,
Since it's not a development initiated request, just trying
okay. Yep.
try and allow them to retain the same abilities that they're currently afforded.
Okay.
Other questions for Clayton? If not, this is a public hearing. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the council? Do you want to come to the podium, please, and identify yourself and give us your address?
My name is Elmer Weber, and I was having a hard time understanding some of the discussion because I didn't have the history of it. But the area across the road on Merle Hay Road, is that going to be rezoned? And what, if it is, what does that do for the property?
Clayton, can you help respond to that question?
Where specifically on Merle Hay Road?
Zion Lutheran Church.
That area, let me go to that map. That area is currently zoned MUC Mixed Use Center ROC2.
What page are you on, Clayton?
This is page 10. And it is proposed to be rezoned to MU2 Community Mixed Use, which is a comparable zoning district to the existing. So there's no known nonconformities that would be created as a result of this.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Again, this is a public hearing on this item. Your name and address, please. Your name and address, please.
Kelly Gillespie, and I live at 5604 Northwest 66. And I think you're changing it to R1. I didn't see,
What specifically are we changing, Donna?
well, or it was just near my property. And I'm just wondering what R1 is. Is there like a,
Is there a
is there
particular,
a
particular
code
map
that I can see what that is?
Yeah, so within the mixed-use district, I did fail to point out, there is one singular parcel that's just east of the Lions Club that would be rezoned to R175.
Okay.
And that's an existing home there that's used residentially, so just trying to reflect the current use.
So I'm up here.
You're up here?
Yeah, so I think I'm just into the yellow. But I got one of your
Yeah.
postcards. So what is this? Is this
Yeah,
commercial?
So all of the area in pink here is proposed to be rezoned to the MU2 mixed use, community mixed use zoning district,
Mhm.
which is comparable to the existing zoning district
Okay.
of mixed use center. It's really just a reclassification of the name and going from 3 districts down to 2, so just consolidating some of
Okay.
those uses. This is still the higher of the 2 uses. And I would direct you to the full zoning code, which is under agenda item 4A. If you were to pull up tonight's agenda, we do have the code draft full here, where you can review the entire zoning code, which gets into the specifics
Okay.
of
So,
the individual districts.
so do you guys try to limit the fast food in this area?
Yeah, we
Would that be
within
limited?
within the mixed use district, we do not allow for drive-throughs. We do allow for restaurants, but David, correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
I believe it's correct that drive-throughs are not permitted within the mixed use district, but restaurants are. So it's not specific that you could have a fast food, but typically they want a drive-through.
Okay,
But we're not getting as specific to say no fast food,
okay,
just no drive-through.
okay. Also, Rhonda, I work at a sign shop, and the windows that the doors that you're talking about, there's frosted vinyl. They can cover that and then
Okay, David and Clayton, please make note of that and offer that to the owners.
Yeah, there you go.
That would be
Yeah.
awesome.
It wouldn't cost you a bush. It would just be something they put on the window and you can take it off.
Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to address the council on this item? Sir?
My name is John Hinchliff, and the address is 11200 Northwest Road Drive. Thanks for hearing us anyway. The very last screen that you had up there, can I ask a couple questions about it? We were here initially when this was zoned IC, correct? It was zoned IC, which simply meant what? What does that mean, IC? Can you?
IC is a zoning district under our current zoning code called Industrial Commerce Park zoning
Okay.
district. And that's a district that's proposed to be eliminated out of the new zoning code and replaced with the E2 General Employment District.
So they're very similar. You're not changing the idea of how it will be used. Is that?
It sounds like we're changing the idea there.
The underlying
bit.
uses and architectural standards within the districts are comparable to the existing IC. I will stop short of saying they are a one-to-one exchange because the E2 district is a result of a consolidation of multiple districts.
Mhm.
We would need to refer back to the zoning code to get into specifics of if there's specific concerns within the E2 district.
So there is no longer an IC zoning?
Under the
Is
new-
that correct?
Under the new zoning district or under the new zoning code, IC is eliminated, 100% gone.
So the area that we're talking about here, that we had these grand plans of putting some warehousing and some general buildings out here in front of us, is now pretty much scrapped. Well, he can't make it work there, so now we have to go to another zoning plan, which allows for more traffic, more sewer, more water, all of those things that enter into it. A lot more cement on that now too, is what it sounds to me like. You'll have restaurants, is that correct?
No, I don't believe that the developer that is planning any changes in his plan, and that is certainly not being driven by this. His plan that he presented and has been presented remains unchanged. And there is, I don't know, so there's not an intent to change what is being proposed in that as part of this process tonight.
And I would further add on to that, as that developer has gone through their development planning process, which they have not submitted a site plan or a plat, that's extra steps and notification will be sent. But as they've gone through that process, staff has been advising them to prepare their plans based on the E2 zoning district. So items you have seen are based on the standards within the E2 district.
Which is the same as the IC, is what you're saying.
Correct. So they have, they intend to develop it according to the plans you have.
Have we made any progress on the water that we're going to supply for this IC or this E2 now? Has that been taken care of? Is the sewer, or how we will take the sewer away from there, has that been taken care of? Storm drainage and how water flows off that, has that been taken care of by this new ordinances or whatever they were talking about now? Have those things been developed now?
That's not part of this process. That's all part of this.
That's just a simple question.
And exactly, I understand, right? And that's not part of, but everything you're talking about, the stormwater infrastructure, the sewer infrastructure, the water infrastructure, that'll all have to be available on the site before, as part of the construction process. So none of this changes any of that. And this is a zoning process and is really just part of our overall zoning code. Has nothing to do with the specific proposal, what will be used on that land. And no building will occur until that infrastructure is extended to that site. That's part of any zoning requirement, any construction requirement that we would have.
So they'll have the pertinent infrastructure to handle
Absolutely.
whatever you're
Yes.
going to put over there.
Yes.
And protect the landowners around it from any
Absolutely.
water, sewage, any of that stuff around it.
All those
That'll-
requirements will be included.
That'll be a different process, and we would encourage you to continue to be involved and watch what's
Yeah,
happening
yep.
there and
All right.
come when we're discussing all of that.
And we do provide separate notice of those. We have to encourage you and invite part of the review approval process of those plans. Nothing has been submitted to date, so I would just be speculating on when they may decide. But we certainly encourage you to stay involved in the process, and we will certainly be inviting you to stay involved.
So you develop these zoning things and allow for people to make plans without having the infrastructure already completed. You don't have the infrastructure in place.
There
to
are
handle
plans
it.
for that, but that's not part of our discussion tonight. But you're raising really good questions, and we'll make sure that you get answers to your questions. But
Very good.
that's why I'm encouraging you to stay involved, because
I
we
would
will.
invite you to reach out to city staff
Yep.
myself, and we can have these conversations and get into the details on that specifically. I'd be happy to provide you my contact.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to make any comments on this particular item? If not, I will close the public hearing at 8:48. Do we have a motion to approve first consideration of ordinance number 1092?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion, council? Seeing none. Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Burkhart,
Yes.
Coe,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
Ready.
Yes.
Motion passed. Moving on to item 4D, conduct a public hearing and consider approval of the first reading of ordinance number 1093, amending the official zoning map for .54 acres from CD to C3. Subject property is located at 5055 Merle Hay Road. PZ case 2304. We'll open this public hearing at 8:49. Clayton.
Johnston Golf Development LLC has submitted a request to rezone approximately a half an acre of parcel at 5055 Merle Hay Road from CD Conservation District to C3 Highway Service Commercial Zoning District. You might be asking yourself, we just took action on adopting a new zoning code map. Why do we have this in front of us tonight? And the answer to that is they need this approval to happen before the new zoning code map goes into effect. So we have the new zoning map. The previous action item was intended to go into effect on May 1, 2023. And they're looking to have this go into effect April 3rd, 2023, about a month early, to support their desire to submit site plans and get approval to progress their development for construction this spring. So that's why you're seeing it in two separate action items like you are this evening. The western portion of their development, as I have pulled up on the screen, is currently zoned C3 district. So really, this is just an adjustment to the existing zoning district boundary to follow the outline of the proposed Bombers Golf and Family Entertainment Center building. And other areas of the property would remain unchanged per zoning. And most of the items that you'll see related to this will likely be questions related to site planning, I would presume. And we do have a site plan submitted and is queued up to be before you, I believe, on April 3rd. I did provide notice to adjoining property owners. No public comments have been received to date. Planning and Zoning Commission has recommended approval of this. I'm happy to go into further detail if needed, answer any questions. I don't know if there may be members of the audience that wish to speak tonight.
Does the council have any questions for Clayton? Seeing none, is there anyone in the audience who would like to address the council on this item? They're disappointing you, Clayton. Okay. Well, seeing none, we will close the public hearing then at 8:52. Do we have a motion to approve first consideration of ordinance number 1093?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Council, further discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Cope,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart.
Yes.
Motion passed. Moving on to the consent agenda. Do we have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Evans,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Cope.
Yes.
Motion passed. Moving on to the non-consent agenda. Item 7A, consider resolution number 23-2057, approving and authorizing execution of a second amendment to the development agreement by and among the City of Johnston, Birchwood Crossing Business Park LLC, and Hubble Realty Company. Adam.
Good evening, Mayor, Council. I have in front of you the second amendment to the Birchwood Development Agreement. First, the original agreement was approved in 2018, deals with Lot 1 and 2 of Plat 7 of the Birchwood Development Project. The one with the yellow arrow here is the specific property under question. Amendment number 1 to this agreement was passed in the wake of COVID, and it segregated Lot 1 from Lot 2. The original agreement provided for an 80% 5-year rebate for the construction of a Flex-Tex building on both of these lots, as well as assistance for the construction of the remainder of Birchwood Court, Carter Court, which goes north up to Northwest 54th. Amendment number 2 is been requested by Hubble Realty. It would amend the 5-year 80% rebate to a 6-year 80% rebate plus an additional, it's about $20,000 on year 7. The request is precipitated on the COVID-19 pandemic having a significant impact on the assessed value of their building. The lowered assessed value resulted in significantly less than the expected $920,000 for their pro forma in rebates. And then there's also a significant history on the development of these 2 lots. Happy to go into some of those details. Some folks may recall that, but there's about 24 years worth of development efforts that back up against these last 2 lots here. Hubble's full request is attached. Pull that up here for reference. Their original request estimated a total receipt of about that $708,000. 2 current rebates that they've received have been $104,000. That number's correct. Partial rebate based off of partial finishings of the interior finishings for the building. And then their 2021 rebate was actually closer to $125,000. So the difference between these 2 is how we've arrived at the proposed amendment for the 7th year's rebate of $20,000 that reflects the difference between the actual assessed value and the 80% rebate versus the rebate on the first year in which some of those interior spaces were not finished, as opposed to the proposed $50,000 in the request. The amendment as attached is recommended for approval by the Economic Development Committee. There's been several conversations with Joe Petrzinski with Hubble on the amendment. I believe Joe's out of town today, but there should be an amendment, or there should be a Hubble representative in the audience or online to answer any questions. With that, I'll pause. Happy to take any questions you've got or direct.
Council, have any questions for Adam?
So Adam, even it's a little confusing to me what the actual amount ends up being, but the original development agreement that we had with Hubble capped the amount of the TIF rebate at $920,000. Is that correct?
That's correct. The way we typically write our development agreements is percentage based, in this case 80%. We would ask the developer for an estimated assessed value of the project, and we would calculate the maximum rebate amount based off of that estimate and the typical TIF tax rate. That's how we got to the $920,000. Based off of the current assessed values in the current agreement, I'd calculate it'd be closer to $625,000.
So even with the additional year, they're going to be pretty substantially below the maximum under the development agreement of $920,000.
Yeah, they'll be significantly underneath the rebate amounts, either at the 5-year or at the 6 years plus the $20,000.
Yeah, and, I think one reason why I was willing to support this, certainly at the Economic Development Committee, was the building was completed in April of 2020, which certainly was about as tough a time to open up a building and try to get tenants in. So I think adding an extra year makes sense. So that's why I certainly supported it at the Economic Development Committee.
That also was my rationale, Councilmember Cope. In that same vein, I think that this is important. I also would implore the developer, clearly I know there's no plans at present. It's a good-looking building as it currently stands. We want nothing more than another one next door to it, and I know you do too. So please understand that we are doing everything we can to help you get to that point.
Are there comments or questions by the council of Adam or the developer? Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address council on this item? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve resolution number 23-57?
Move.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember-
Further discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Evans,
No.
Martin,
Yes.
Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Coe.
Yes.
Motion passed. Item 7B, consider approval of claims in the amount of $710,034.59.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion? Cindy, vote please.
Councilmember Martin,
Yes.
Ready,
Yes.
Burkhart,
Yes.
Coe,
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
Motion passed. City Administrator staff comments. Mike.
I don't have any specific comments. HR Finance, if we could just talk real quick about our upcoming meeting, I'd appreciate it after the meeting. Thank you.
Anything else from staff? None? Councilmember Martin.
I have no comments.
Burkhart.
Nothing tonight, Mayor.
Pass.
I'll pass, thank you.
Well,
The floor is yours.
I'm good. Nothing.
The only thing that the only thing I wanted to share is about a week ago, 9 days ago or so, we hosted a celebration for the Kosovo's 15th anniversary of their Independence Day up at DMAC. And it was a wonderful event. About 200 people turned out for it. I had the honor of emceeing the program, and we had a long list of dignitaries and others who have been involved in the Kosovo relationship speak at that reception, and just did an incredible job of sharing their experiences, the history, and the relationships that have developed with Kosovo and the Kosovar people. So it was a very nice event, and our former city administrator was very involved in helping organize it, and we showed appreciation to him as well as the staff and others who support the Kosovo Consulate's office here in downtown Des Moines. So anyway, it was a nice event, and again, it just made made everyone feel good about how far we've come in that relationship and the support that we're providing to the Kosovo people. So anyway, with that, is there anything else for the good of the order? If not, we are adjourned. Thanks all.